Hello everybody and welcome to the next video in my quotes about characters burial rites series. That title is definitely a work in progress. Today we are going to be talking about one of my top 3 fictional men that I trust. In fact, maybe one of the only 3 fictional men that I trust, and that is Assistant Reverend Thorvaldor Jonsson, otherwise known as Toti, Agnes's self-appointed spiritual advisor and the most beautiful soul in the whole world who quite likes hands. Today, and just like in my other videos, I'm going to tell you my top 5 quotes that either Toti says or that other characters say about him that I think represents him in a really effective kind of way. And by effective, I don't mean that in an evaluative sort of way, but effective for your study kind of way. Before I begin, it would be remiss of me to not wish all those who are celebrating a happy Midnight's release day. I still haven't listened to the album at point of recording, but I hope that you have, because it's got to be good luck, right? Anyway, let's get to the quotes. Number 1 that I have chosen is something that Toti actually says, and we find this on page 98 during an exchange between Agnes and the Assistant Reverend, I should say. Now, Agnes had just called Toti a child, and Toti calls her on it and says, "You just called me a child," in what is described as quite a disinterested manner. Agnes says, "I offended you." Toti retorts and says that he wasn't offended. However, he then goes on to list his qualifications, which, yes, he speaks Latin, Greek, and Danish, go off. But then he says, "God has chosen me to shepherd you to redemption." So that's the quote that I quite like. God has chosen me to shepherd you to your redemption. And I really like this because it asserts him as being quite strong-willed, which is quite a stark contrast to the other ways in which we have seen Toti depicted. Now, I also quite like this because it ties in the concept of redemption. Obviously, it uses the word redemption, but I think that it's a really strong piece of foreshadowing, but also irony, because Agnes can't seek redemption at this point, at least not in a worldly capacity. And as Agnes is somebody who isn't that much of a strong believer, this is quite an ironic thing to say to her. Agnes, however, goes on to say, "No, I chose you, Reverend," which I think is really interesting because it depicts the differences between the two's religious values, thus highlighting a cultural assumption, of course. My second quote for today is on page 120, and this is Agnes describing Toti, and it says, "Everything will be over so quickly. And the Reverend, how young he is, and how I still don't know what to say to him. I thought he could help me as he helped me over the river. But talking to him only reminds me of how everything in my life has worked against me, and how unloved I have been." Amazing. You could use that quote for so many different things. It shows us that Toti showing Agnes this love and this sense of belonging, this essence of humanity, is hurtful as well as helpful for her, because it reminds her of what she hasn't had in her entire life. But also it shows the differences between the two characters in terms of their life experiences. Agnes doesn't even know what to say to him because of the life that he has lived. It also shows us that the belief in which Agnes is putting on superstitions, because she is looking at her dreams as though they are a real thing, because he didn't help her over the river. That was something that happened in one of her dreams, but she's recounting it as though it is truth, which I think is really interesting. It also helps us to have a descriptor if we're looking at describing Toti ourselves, how young he is, something like that. It would be useful to use in conjunction with pale inexperience, as Beyondall refers to him later in the text, and that's a pretty good pretty good combination of descriptors for Toti. I also really like, if we go on, I know this is a long one, but when Agnes says, "I expected him to understand me start. I want him to understand me, but I'm a fool to think we speak the same tongue. I may as well be talking to him with a stone in my mouth, trying to find a language that we both understand." I mean, that's amazing, because it's linking into the motif / symbol of the stone, which is a really interesting kind of, I feel like it's not obvious on a first read, But also I love, I'm a fool to think we speak the same tongue, trying to find a language we both understand. Because of the cultural assumptions of the time, they are so starkly different. They are almost binary oppositions to one another because of their religious values, because of their gender, even because of their class to some extent. They exist as polar opposites, and I love it because so early in the text Agnes is defining this, but then later in the text they become so close, and it's so beautiful. Next we have Agnes telling Toti about the dream that she had. I remember looking up as I fell into the darkness and seeing the ground close back up over my head. It shut out the light and the face of the man who had appeared. I was dropped into the earth, buried in silence, and it was unbearable. And then I woke. Buried in silence? Toti felt his mouth go dry. Was I that man? He asked. Agnes nodded. She had tears in her eyes. It terrified me when I saw you then. I recognized you from my dream, and I knew that you were bound to my life in some way, and it worried me. If you're looking at the concept of fate, amazing. Again, if you're looking at superstition, if you're looking at Agnes's beliefs, and if you're just looking at the relationship between Agnes and Toti, this is a fantastic example of some really strong evidence. You were bound to my life. That is a great example of dialogue because Agnes says it out loud, but also a hyperbole. He's not literally bound to her life. I love it. 4. On page 166, we have Beyondel and Toti having a bit of a conversation, and Beyondel says to Toti, Assistant Reverend Thorvador, you might be forgiven for thinking that friendship will direct this murderess to the way of truth and repentance. You are young and inexperienced. I bear some of the blame for this. So, like earlier, if you want a descriptor for Toti, young and inexperienced, as referred to by Beyondel, one of the most authoritative figures in the society, we also have Beyondel bearing some of the blame for this, which is quite profound, but this is in response to Toti saying that he just talks to Agnes rather than praying with her, rather than talking to her about the gospel. He tries to paraphrase, he humanizes her, right? And Beyondel says that friendship will direct the murderess to way of truth and repentance. But it kind of does, right? Like, Beyondel is wrong. Agnes does get to speak her truth, and there are people that believe her, and that is so important to Agnes. So Beyondel's wrong. This is foreshadowing. But also, if you're looking at the concept of truth, or even the concept of repentance, this quote would be really awesome. Lucky last is a little bit heartbreaking, and it is what Toti says to Agnes just before she is executed. So Agnes has told Toti that she's not ready, and that's emotional enough in itself. But Agnes is talking about how she can't feel her hands, and Toti says, I am here for you, Agnes. It was the only thing he could say. And I think that that's beautiful, and I think that that's true. He is there for her, and he was the entire time he knew her. And if I'm trying to talk about that in my exam, if I'm trying to talk of the loyalty that Toti has for Agnes, if I'm talking about the friendship, the bond, him saying he is there for her is a really important statement that he makes. Later on page 327, Toti says, I won't let go of you, Agnes. I'm right here. Really demonstrating the loyalty that he has for her, the dedication, and the fact that he worked so hard on her. Honorable mention has to go to I will save her when Toti says that at the very start of the novel, because I think that that is the almost personification of Toti's character growth when he says that, and it's a favorite moment in the whole novel for me. So those are my top 5, I guess 6, maybe 7. I got a little carried away there. Quotes that either are said by Toti or are representative of Toti. If you have a request for another character or another video, please let me know. I'm having a great time. Love being in my YouTube era. I hope that you're doing well and that you are excited and feeling confident and ready for the exam. If not, let me know, because I reckon I can convince you otherwise. If you're watching this video, then you are doing something, and that is something. All right, let me know if you need anything at all. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye. Peace. I like the quote. Too long, don't read. I love it.